Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The rain was pouring down. Each drop hit the windshield with the force of a hammer, making visibility almost nil. I drove down the lonely road, a narrow, winding country road where neither the lights of the city nor the bustle of the world seemed to exist. All that remained was the darkness of the night, the roar of the wind and the monotonous sound of the rain that seemed to insist on devouring me. My car, an old model that had already shown signs of wear and tear over the past year, was not exactly at its best. But there was no other way to get to the town where my brother lived. I needed to get there fast. I had promised to be there for dinner, but the delays began to pile up. The storm was getting worse with every mile. Then, without warning, the engine began to make a strange sound, as if it were choking. The noise intensified into an irregular knocking sound. I could no longer ignore it. I slammed on the brakes, and when the car finally stopped, the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence surrounding it. The rain was still coming down hard, but everything else seemed to have stopped. "Fuck, it can't be possible," I muttered, and tried to start the engine again. Nothing. A sigh escaped my lips as frustration washed over me. I looked around. On both sides of the road, a couple of dry, twisted trees stood like lifeless shadows. On the horizon, the glow of lightning was barely visible, and the sound of thunder grew deeper and more ominous. I stood there for a few moments, wondering what to do. I knew there was no service station nearby. The last time I had passed this way, months ago, there was barely any signage. It was the kind of place where a car could be stranded for hours with no one passing by. The cell phone? No. I had no signal. My only recourse was to walk, was the only possible option for salvation. Or so I thought. "Excellent," my voice murmured, with a hint of irony. With a resigned sigh, I left the car behind and started walking. Raindrops lashed my face with every step, but I had no choice. The road seemed endless. I felt small, insignificant under the gray sky and the fury of the storm. The fog began to lift as I drove on, and the darkness grew thicker. Each step echoed in my ears as if someone was following me, but it was nothing more than the sound of my own feet on the mud, as lonely as everything around me. Minutes passed, and then hours, and the rain did not let up. I could not see well, the water dripping down my face and blinding me. Every time lightning illuminated the horizon, the shadows of the trees stretched and deformed, creating strange and deformed figures. Suddenly, I began to hear something. A sound I couldn't identify, but it added to the cadence of the storm. A somewhat strange car. In the distance, almost imperceptible under the din of the storm, I could make out the lights of a vehicle coming down the road. At first, I thought it was my salvation. Maybe someone would help me, but something about the way the car was moving made me hesitate. It wasn't a vehicle that was approaching in a hurry because of the storm, but rather it kept a steady speed, as if it was searching for something. I stood still on the side of the road and watched as the car's lights slowly approached. There was nowhere else on that lonely, forgotten road where someone could stop for no reason, and the feeling of discomfort grew inside me. The old car drove past, but when it had already crossed completely, I saw it. The lights suddenly went out. The car stopped in the middle of the road, and there it stayed. I felt a pressure in my chest. Something was not right. I couldn't explain why, but my whole being was warning me to stay away. Uncertainty took hold of me, and my survival instinct, so far dormant, began to burn. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to calm down. But the sound of the doors opening, followed by footsteps, made me fling them open. There, in the middle of the storm, I saw a figure get out of the car. A man, tall, strongly built, with deep white skin, wet and disheveled clothes. His silhouette stood out in the glare of the lightning. The man made no movement, just stood watching. Something in his posture made me doubt his intentions, as if he was waiting for me to approach, or worse, for him to approach me. My mind began to wander. Why had he stopped the car? Who was this guy? What the hell did he want from me? I decided not to wait to find out. Quickly, I pulled off the road, stepping into the brush and trying to move quietly. I was totally soaked, but fear gave me the strength to move forward. I heard the man's footsteps on the asphalt slowly approaching, closer and closer. I stopped, crouched down, breathing hard. I could barely hear myself think above the rumbling of the storm, but what I did hear was what chilled my blood. Deep, heavy breathing. It wasn't mine. Someone was behind me. Panic hit me hard. I turned to face whoever was following me, but I saw no one. However, the smell of wet earth and sweat enveloped me, as if the presence was too close. With my heart beating a mile a minute, I tried to move faster, but something or someone wouldn't let me. I ran towards the road looking for some shelter, but there was nothing. The fog thickened my vision even more, and the sound of footsteps behind me intensified. Something, or someone, was there, following me, so quiet and stealthy that I had trouble distinguishing between reality and my own paranoia. In a fit of desperation, I made an impulsive decision. I turned right and entered a narrow path that cut through the forest. The rain no longer mattered. Fear had overshadowed any sense of cold or discomfort. I needed to get out of there. I needed to be away from that presence that felt so close, so real. The trees loomed around me like shadows of a bad omen, and the creaking of the branches under my feet seemed deafening. Darkness surrounded me, and the whistling of the wind joined the echo of footsteps behind me. I ran until I could run no more, until my legs could no longer keep up. I stopped and tried to catch my breath. Everything was silent. Nothing was moving. Nothing could be heard, but my chest was still heaving and my senses were alert, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft at first, almost like a murmur. And then I felt it. The warmth of a hand on my shoulder. I screamed, turned suddenly, but there was no one there. Just the cold and the rain. The storm. Was I going crazy? Was my mind, worn out by fear and loneliness, playing tricks on me? Or maybe something much worse was happening? I didn't know. But what I did know was that I was stuck on that road in that storm, and that something or someone wasn't going to let me go so easily. I'll never know for sure, but I don't want to know anymore. Sometimes the greatest danger is not in what lurks in the dark, but in what our minds allow us to see. We live in a world that constantly bombards us with certainties, with explanations, but in the end, what scares us most is uncertainty. It is not the shadow that moves or the noise we hear in the distance, but the doubt of whether what we perceive is real or a product of our own fear. That night, as I walked alone on that dark and lonely road, I no longer knew if I was running from something real or if I was running from myself, from my own demons. Was it fear that pushed me forward, or the simple need to believe that there was something, someone, I could face? What I learned along the way, or perhaps what I already knew deep down inside, is that there are times when the real threat is not the one we see, but the one we fear. And sometimes the greatest enemy is not a killer in the shadows, but that voice that whispers in our head, telling us that we are alone, that there is no way out, that we can no longer trust even our own perception. In that endless darkness, it was doubt that really paralyzed me. This marked my life forever. I received a message a few hours ago that left me with a sense of intrigue. It was brief, direct, and I must confess, somewhat disturbing. It said, "See you tonight, 7:35, at El Fogon Gourmet, as agreed." What did it all mean? There was something in those words that left me with a bad taste in my mouth, as if, in some mysterious way, I had been waiting for that message without knowing it. But who was she? The truth is, I had no idea. I had never planned a date with anyone. Not even the name of the restaurant sounded familiar, nor the location, let alone the time. However, the message was so clear and precise that something inside me, perhaps curiosity or an inexplicable need to understand what was going on, urged me to go ahead. What would be in store for me that night? I left home at nightfall, with the rain pounding on the windows of my car, as the streets seemed to crumble under the weight of the downpour. The storm was relentless, the kind of rain that makes everything fuzzy and dark. Every streetlight I passed was a grim flash, as if the whole world was plunged into a watery nightmare. My hands were shaking slightly at the wheel, and I was having trouble concentrating. Something wasn't right, I knew, but I couldn't stop. El Fogon Gourmet was located on a street I had never traveled before. At first I thought maybe it was a new part of town, but as I looked at the building, its old, weather-beaten facade, I realized it was not. It was there, crouched in the middle of the storm with its fogged windows and a wooden door swaying in the wind. There was nothing gourmet, nothing luxurious, nothing elegant about the place. Just desolation. I parked the car right in front of the entrance, and how curious, the place seemed deserted. There was only a faint yellowish light in the corner, illuminating an entrance that surprisingly no one seemed to use. Where was the manager, I wondered, and the waitress? There seemed to be no one around. The silence was really intriguing, so deep and heavy, as if everything was in a kind of pause, waiting for something. But what would that be? Something that was already happening, although I couldn't identify it. What a mystery. I got out of the car, water soaking my jacket and the sound of thunder rumbling through the sky. The door creaked open, and the air inside was thick, damp, as if the restaurant itself was full of secrets. The light from the lamps was low, almost dim, as if trying to hide in the shadows. The floor was slippery, and the scent in the air was not that of food, but something more metallic, stranger. My footsteps echoed off the empty walls, and for a moment, I wondered if I was alone. I walked to a lone table in the corner, where a flickering candle barely illuminated its base. What strange place is this? There were no waiters, no usual sound of plates and silverware. It was as if time had stopped, as if the atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something that, oddly enough, was not me. And yet there I was, as if some mysterious force was drawing me into the depths of that eerie atmosphere. I looked at my watch. 7:35. Was the appointment supposed to be now? What could be happening? I sat up and my heart began to pound harder. My mind kept repeating the same questions. Who was she? Why had she agreed to come here? The restaurant was empty, but I felt a presence. Something was watching me, although I couldn't see anything. A few minutes passed and the door slowly opened. How intriguing. The creaking of the hinges startled me, filling the air with a palpable mystery. Then I saw a figure cross the threshold, somewhat blurred in the gloom, but at the same time unmistakable. It was a woman. The dim light illuminated her for an instant, and my heart stopped for a moment. She was not at all what I had imagined. Her face, neither beautiful nor ugly, had something peculiar, a strange detail in her expression that made me shiver. But was he really smiling, or was it just that his lips seemed to curve in an unusual way? What an enigma. He approached the table, and the curious thing was that he didn't say a single word. He sat across from me without a gesture of recognition, as if we were in parallel worlds. Then, a long silence settled between us, almost palpable. The rain was hitting the window pane with such fury. Was it trying to warn us of something we couldn't even imagine? The clock struck 7:40, and surprisingly, the woman made no move. Neither did I. A strange feeling began to come over me, a feeling that was hard to describe in words, more like a knot in my stomach that was tightening little by little. Why couldn't I speak? I knew I should say something, but my words seemed to choke before they came out. A shiver ran down my spine, and, oddly enough, the urge to leave immediately grew. What was really going on between us? At that instant, the door opened again. A man entered the restaurant. I didn't see him clearly, but something about his presence made me alert. At first I thought he was just another customer, but I soon realized he was not. He quickly approached the table without looking around, as if he already knew exactly where he was supposed to go. When he arrived, he stopped in front of the woman. It was only for a moment, but it was enough for me to realize that she was waiting for him. The two exchanged a fleeting glance, almost so subtle that it could have been missed. The man made a curious gesture, as if asking permission to do something. The woman, with a slight nod of her head, nodded. But what did that sign really mean? I was intrigued, trying to unravel the secret of that shared instant. My thoughts were triggered. Something was wrong. Something was brewing there, within those crumbling walls, in that place forgotten by all. However, my body was not reacting. I was paralyzed, trapped in that corner of the room with the rain beating against the window and the sound of the wind filling the space. The man sat quietly, and that left me intrigued. Why didn't he show up? Why didn't he offer an apology for his tardiness? It was as if everything had been orchestrated from the start, and I wondered what was at stake. Should I leave? Was it wise to stay? Or maybe I should call someone. It all seemed like a maze in which every decision could lead to an unexpected outcome. Fear began to bubble up inside me, but I wasn't sure if it was because of what was happening or what might happen if I decided to stay a moment longer. What secrets did that stillness hide? What revelations awaited in the gloom? The lights began to flicker and the woman turned her head slowly as if something had disturbed her. I watched as the man looked at her, unhurriedly, but with a calmness that made my skin crawl. Suddenly he leaned forward, and his words reached my table, but I couldn't understand them. It was as if everything had become a blur. The sound of the storm seemed to fade away, and all that remained was that mute conversation between them, that tension taking over the atmosphere. I got up from my seat, but why did I do it? It was as if some mysterious force was guiding me. My feet moved toward the door, but just as I was about to cross the threshold, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding with an intensity that surprised me, and the darkness of the restaurant enveloped me like an unsettling embrace. Was there any way to escape this strange situation? Suddenly, a bright light burst into the place, dazzling me for an instant. When my eyes adjusted again, the figure of the man had disappeared. Where was the woman who had been in his seat? And the restaurant, in a bewildering twist, had fallen back into silence. The exit door was closed as if it had never existed. What was really going on? My mind began to reel. Thoughts were piling up, but I couldn't process them. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was stuck there, in the rain, in that empty restaurant, not understanding what was going on. Everything around me was a lie, a cruel game of fate that I could not control. And though I tried to get out, I knew I could not. The storm continued outside, but the anguish inside me only grew. Sometimes real fear comes not from what you can see, but from what you can't understand. From what you know is happening, but fail to recognize until it's too late. It's hard to accept that sometimes the decisions we make, however small, like accepting an invitation or a drink, can lead us to a place from which there is no return. Because deep down, it is not the darkness that terrifies us. It is the idea that we are not the masters of our destiny, that at the least expected moment, a strange being, a stranger, has the power to pull the strings of our life without us even suspecting it. We may never understand whether that encounter was our choice or a carefully laid trap. But what is certain is that once you get carried away, it's too late to regret it. Perhaps the real fear is not in monsters or in the supernatural, but in that human capacity to play with control, to manipulate circumstances so subtly that you don't realize you are already trapped until everything is irreversible. I was just a boy when this story happened. The rain was still falling nonstop. I was soaked to the bone and my shoes echoed with the water that accumulated in the puddles. But the most complicated thing was not the rain, but that the sun had already hidden behind the mountains and darkness was looming over the road, heavy and wet. I was pedaling home from school in the storm because I had no other choice. The bus never came and my mother had always warned me not to take the shortcut, but that afternoon the need to get home made me ignore her warnings. I felt tired, my back soaking wet and my hands freezing, as I gripped the handlebars of the bike tightly, fighting the wind that seemed to want to take me in another direction. The shortcut, a winding route that went through a wheat field and then lost itself in the trees until it reached the village, seemed deserted. I didn't see a single light on the horizon. The road was rural and very neglected, lonely and without streetlights. It was just a narrow dirt lane that slipped through the thicket of the forest. The sound of the drops hitting my helmet and the distant roar of thunder were the only noises that reached my ears. But suddenly, I saw a figure in the distance. At first I thought it was a tree or a shadow cast by the storm, but as I got closer I realized it was a person. A man, or something that looked like a man. He was crouched at the side of the road, his back hunched forward. He seemed to be cowering, as if trying to protect himself from the rain, but the figure moved slowly, almost as if he was waiting for something or someone. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to keep pedaling, but something in my head told me I should stop. My heart was pounding in my chest and my breathing became irregular, although I wasn't sure if it was from exertion or nervousness. At that hour and under that storm, a person in the middle of nowhere could not be a good sign, but my upbringing told me I should offer help, not ignore someone in danger. Or, well, So I thought. I stopped. The bicycle wheel crunched in the mud loudly, and the figure slowly turned around, raising his head. He was an old man, his skin wrinkled like paper and his face covered by a graying beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in many years. His eyes, however, were not what one would expect from a man of his age. They were fixed, observant, almost inordinately intense eyes. He looked at me for a long second without a word. "Is he all right?" I asked, though my voice came out shaky, almost unintentionally. The man nodded his head as if acknowledging my presence, but did not respond. I began to feel a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know why, but something about him didn't seem quite sure. The atmosphere around us was thickening, as if the air had become thick and tense. The rain, though fierce, seemed a minor detail in the face of that growing sense of discomfort. "Do you need help?" I repeated, somewhat firmer, though inside I was no longer so sure I wanted to stay. The man did nothing, just stood there motionless, his eyes fixed on mine as if he were evaluating whether or not to speak. What puzzled me even more was that he didn't move when I called out to him, as if his body was so embedded in the ground that he had become part of the storm. Something was wrong. I couldn't realize what exactly, but I couldn't ignore it. Then as I watched him, I noticed something glistening in his hands, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't a reflection of rain, it was the glint of metal, something sharp. I couldn't see it clearly from a distance, but my instinct told me that this was not something a lonely old man would need to survive the storm. It was at that moment that I realized something wasn't right. The figure of the old man who had seemed harmless to me before had completely changed. His eyes had hardened, and he was now staring at me with a calculating coldness. A shiver ran through my body. The feeling was as if I had fallen into a dead-end hole, with no way to escape. Without thinking, I turned around to get on my bike and keep pedaling. My heart was pounding, cold sweat mingling with the rain soaking my shirt. But before I could turn around completely, I heard the sound of movement behind me. I turned quickly and saw him. The old man had approached, much faster than would have been possible for someone his age. The metallic sheen I'd seen earlier was now clearly visible. A knife, large blade glinting in the lightning light. On its face there was not a hint of mercy. "Get away!" I shouted at him, thinking I could strike fear into his heart. My voice was lost in the roar of thunder, but the man did not stop. He wasn't just an old man lost in the middle of the storm. He was something much more menacing. Terror paralyzed me for a second. Why hadn't I run away immediately when I felt the threat? The wind was blowing furiously, blowing the drops towards my face, but I could no longer hear anything but the deafening ringing in my ears. Suddenly the old man lunged toward me, not with the clumsiness one would expect from someone so old, but with terrifying speed, as if his body, which at first seemed frail, had accumulated supernatural strength. The knife flashed again, and its shadow cast itself toward me like a lethal and dangerous presence. My first instinct was to pedal as fast as I could, but mud and water got in the way, the bike slipping on the slippery ground. I was trapped. I looked back and saw the old man approaching, knife raised. He wasn't going to give me a chance. My heart was about to burst, but at that moment something saved me. The lightning. The storm had decided to release a discharge that illuminated everything around me in a split second. It was enough for me to see the terrain in front of me. Without thinking, I turned the handlebars hard and launched myself in a completely different direction, a detour into a small tree-covered path. The old man didn't stop. His gasping breath and shadow continued to stalk me. However, at that instant, something inside me, an instinctive impulse, made me speed up. I was no longer so far from the village, and the possibility of escape was becoming more real. The rain was coming down hard, and the only sound I could hear was the sound of my tires fighting the mud as I sped away from the darkness that had tried to trap me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw the first lights of the town shining on the horizon. Behind me, the figure of the old man disappeared into the storm as if he had never existed. My breathing became calmer, but the fear was still rooted in my chest. I knew it wasn't all over. Something told me that it had not been an accident that I had found myself on that road. Something else was behind it all. Something that only time could reveal. But that night, at least, I managed to escape. Sometimes we think that danger presents itself in obvious ways, in what we can see and recognize with the naked eye. We believe that evil always has a clear and obvious form. However, the reality is more subtle. Danger can be in unexpected places, in an unfamiliar corner, in a figure that seems fragile and unthreatening. It is not so much the monster hiding in the dark that really scares us, but rather that which makes us let our guard down and lose caution. The old man I encountered in that storm, a man who seemed helpless, left me with a lesson I will never forget. He made me understand that vulnerability can be just a facade that hides the darkest part of humanity. I never knew why he chose me as his victim or what drove him to act that way, but what I do know is that the fear I felt came not only from what he was doing, but from what he represented. The harsh reality that even those who seem most helpless can be capable of unimaginable acts of evil. My vacations have not been the same since this story happened. From the moment I walked through the door, something in that room made my hair stand on end. The hotel was called a cozy night, but comfort was the last thing I found there. After an exhausting day of flying and a cab ride to a remote corner of suburban Quebec, I just wanted to rest. However, the feeling that someone was watching me ran through me like a shiver. It wasn't simply paranoia, it was a palpable impression, as if someone had been following me from the airport. The hotel lobby was a dark and uninviting place, dimly lit, with dark wooden furniture that, far from being welcoming, added to the grayish air of the place. The receptionist, a woman with an expressionless face, handed me the key without a word. Not a good evening, not a smile, just an awkward silence as she took the card. I had the feeling that there was no one else left in the hotel, that I was alone in that huge building with endless corridors. I went up to the third floor, and as I reached the door of my room, a shiver ran down my spine. The door was a dull brown color, somewhat stained at the corners. My name was written in typewritten handwriting on a piece of paper taped to the top of the wood. I walked in, dragging my suitcase, which was actually a bit heavy, and let out a sigh of relief. The room wasn't much: a small bed, a very ugly and hard chair, a floor lamp that flickered on and off, and a window that looked out onto an empty parking lot illuminated by the neon lights outside. I took a quick shower to wash off the heaviness of the day, threw myself on the bed, and turned on the TV. There wasn't much on the channels, just local programming that I barely understood. I thought they were in very poor taste. When I turned off the TV, the rain began to beat furiously on the window panes. The sound of the drops grew louder and louder, becoming a constant that, for some reason, made me more uneasy than usual. Yes, I was a little nervous. It was late. It was already past 11 o'clock at night. I thought about going out for a walk around the city, but tiredness got the better of me. I settled into bed and closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but something wouldn't let me relax. The raindrops continued to beat furiously on the glass, and the feeling of being watched persisted, more acute than ever. Suddenly, I heard a light tapping on the door. I sat up in bed, tense, staring at the door as if I could see through it. There was another knock, but it wasn't a normal knocking. It was more like someone was trying to open the door with a slight movement, as if they had touched the knob and stopped. The blood rushed to my head and a knot formed in my stomach. It was as if someone was waiting for me to come open, or worse, waiting for me not to. Time passed. No one else knocked. The rain continued its relentless course. I took a deep breath, not without effort, and got out of bed. I approached the door cautiously. I put my ear close to the threshold, hoping to hear some noise, some indication that someone was on the other side. Nothing, just the steady pounding of the storm. I opened the door a little. No one was there. I felt stupid for my paranoia. It was late. The dark and rainy night had played a trick on me. Surely it was a mistake or some stray guest who had inadvertently knocked on the wrong door. And as much as I wished it was just that. But as I went back inside and settled back into bed, something inside me told me I shouldn't let it go so easily. I didn't bother to check the window locks or the rest of the room. I simply covered myself as best I could up to my head with the sheets and tried to sleep. The rain did not stop. It pounded more furiously, as if it wanted to crush the outside world. But then I heard another noise again. A dull sound, a shuffling. It was very low, almost imperceptible, but clearly a noise coming from the hallway. Fear came over me at once. I stayed glued to the bed, unable to move, breathing as slowly as I could so as not to make a sound. The sound was advancing, as if someone was walking slowly down the hallway, shuffling their feet, perhaps careful not to be heard. It was not the sound of a normal person walking, but something else, something heavy. I could hear the person stop in front of my door. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to move or even breathe. The seconds stretched into an eternity. My mind was a sea of doubts and a lot of fear. A few minutes passed. The sound stopped, and at that moment I thanked God. I could not go back to sleep. Something inside me told me that I had to do something, that I could not stay there waiting for the nightmare to come true. I got up and, trying to make as little noise as possible, I approached the door. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. The hallway was empty. Only the hotel lights illuminated the linoleum floor, casting long, distorted shadows. I thought about calling the front desk, but something inside me told me not to. What would I say? That someone had knocked on my door? It could simply be someone looking for their room. Or worse, it could be that the hotel staff thought I was crazy. I stood there in front of the door for what seemed like hours. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second an anguish that was spiraling out of control. And then, before I could realize it, I heard a sound much clearer, much closer. A breath. Yes, a breath. And it wasn't mine. It was so low I could barely hear it. But I felt it, as if it were on the other side of the door, just behind the wood. The ragged breath of someone waiting in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to do something. I didn't know what, but I knew I wasn't alone. Fear came over me with such intensity that I couldn't move. I felt my heart pounding in my throat and my body tensed, as if it was going to break. The only thing that was clear to me was that I had to act. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the front desk. On the second ring, someone answered. The voice, distant and apathetic, sounded on the other end of the line. My voice came out scratchy, like a barely audible whisper. I think there's someone at my door. On the other end, a silence settled in. I didn't say more, I couldn't, but I sensed something in his tone, something that made me understand that something wasn't right, that something didn't fit in that hotel. Are you sure you didn't get the wrong room? He asked indifferently. At that moment, the sound of heavy, close breathing increased, much louder than before. It sounded as if someone was listening to the call. No, I haven't made any mistake, I replied, my voice cracking with tension. There was another silence, and then the faint click of the line hanging up. Something in my stomach churned. I turned off the light and dropped to the floor, crawling toward the corner of the room. I couldn't move or make a sound. My breathing was intensifying, becoming more ragged, and suddenly I saw a figure peek briefly through the crack in the door. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but his posture was odd, as if he was leaning against something or as if he had hunched over more than usual. I don't know how long I spent there, lying on the floor, waiting for something to happen. The only thing I remember is that at some point the figure disappeared, and with it, the breathing. Again, I thanked God that I was okay until that moment. The storm outside suddenly ceased. I never knew what happened that night again. No one at the hotel seemed to have any answers, neither the receptionist nor the staff. The only thing clear is that the next day, when I left the hotel, I felt like someone was watching me from the shadows, as if there was someone following in my footsteps, even though I couldn't see them. The hotel, a cozy night, was not meant to be. Perhaps like me, the people who stayed there never knew it. Today, thinking back on that night, I realize how much I have changed. The paranoia and fear that paralyzed me at the time taught me a lesson that, while difficult, was necessary. The world is not always as safe as it seems, and the danger signs are not always obvious. That experience left an imprint on me, and I have since learned to be more cautious, to pay attention not only to my instinct, but also to those small alarms that I often ignore. What I once considered just paranoia, I now understand that it was my body warning me of something I could not clearly identify, but that I did perceive. Life has a funny way of teaching us to be attentive and not to trust blindly, even in situations that seem normal. Since that time, I have learned to take a closer look at the people around me, to be more aware of my surroundings and not to let myself get carried away by the comfort of routine. Danger does not always appear as we imagine it, and safety is never guaranteed. Although peace of mind and confidence are important, it is good to be cautious, to always have an alternative plan, and to remember that danger can arise from the least expected places. I now know that you should never let your guard down, and that sometimes being alert is the only way to stay alive. This happened to me several years ago. The storm thundered with such force that for an instant I thought the roof of my apartment would collapse. The wind dragged the rain with fury and the roar of thunder enveloped me, erasing the notion of time. I was sitting on the couch watching a movie that barely interested me but kept me distracted as the storm lashed the city. I hadn't expected anything to interrupt that night. Suddenly the phone rang, breaking the sound of the storm. The number was unknown, but before I could answer, the voice of Camilla, my ex-girlfriend, filtered through the speaker. Fear was evident in her tone, something I hadn't heard from her since we had separated a couple of months ago. Her voice was shaking, broken with panic. She told me someone was trying to break into her house. She heard noises at the back door, banging on the windows, and her distress was palpable, as if she was about to fall apart. Fear pierced my chest like a dagger. Without thinking, I rose from the couch, my hands sweaty despite the chill coming from the storm. I knew it could be a false alarm, like so many others that Camilla had exaggerated in the past. But something made me hesitate. What if this time it wasn't? Concern for his safety, even if he was upset about the breakup, pushed me to act. With a crack in my voice, I promised him I'd be on my way and hung up. I grabbed the car keys and ran for the door. The storm was getting worse. Lightning lit up the darkness, and the rain seemed to fall in thick curtains, as if the city was going to be swallowed by the storm. I hit the gas pedal hard, barely aware of the speed at which I was driving. Fear clouded my thinking. I just wanted to get to her house quickly, make sure everything was okay. The drive that would normally take about 20 minutes was reduced to less than 10. The car was skidding on the wet asphalt, and the streetlights were flickering due to the wind and rain. When I arrived at Camilla's house, an old villa on the outskirts of town, everything was dark, only illuminated by lightning. There was no sign of life around. I stopped in front of the door and quickly got out of the car. I ran towards the entrance, observing the surroundings carefully. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The rain was lashing my face, making my vision difficult, and my glasses were cloudy. I rang the doorbell but got no answer. I banged the door loudly, shouting her name. The silence that answered me was desperate. My heart was pounding, agitated by a growing anxiety. Why wasn't she answering? I banged on the door again, harder this time, until finally I heard footsteps from inside. The door slowly opened, and there stood Camilla, dressed in a wool sweater, her hair in disarray, her eyes bloodshot and her breathing agitated. I looked at her, trying to remain calm, but her look, full of panic, made me understand that something was not right. She told me that she had seen someone in the garden, looking through the window, and that he had tried to get in through the back door. For a while, she had been banging on the windows. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. As frustrated as I was, I couldn't help but feel some sympathy for her. The storm and her story seemed more and more surreal to me. Still, a shiver ran through my body. Something didn't add up. I asked her if she knew who it might be. Camilla shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor as if something was crushing her. I followed her into the living room, which overlooked the back garden. I watched carefully, but saw nothing. The garden was empty. Only the rain and the wind broke the silence. The windows showed no signs of having been forced. I told her I saw nothing and asked her if she was sure of what she had seen. She didn't answer right away, seeming lost in thought. Then a creaking sound from upstairs made me alert. The sound was clearly coming from upstairs, right where the master bedroom was. It wasn't the sound of the storm, it was something different. Camilla whispered that I wasn't alone, that something wasn't right. My breathing became heavier, and my mind began to fill with dark thoughts. What seemed like a false alarm was now becoming something much more disturbing. Camilla pointed a trembling finger down the hallway as if something was paralyzing her. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I tried to remain calm. I decided I had better investigate, and entered the house. The air was cold, colder than it should be on a night like that. The house seemed empty, as if something was absent. The lights in the hallway flickered with each flash of lightning, creating strange shadows on the walls. I asked her if she had any idea who the intruder might be. She shook her head, her face pale and her gaze fixed on the floor as if she couldn't tell me what she was really thinking. I walked over to the living room window and looked again. Nothing. The garden was empty. The windows were intact. It was then that a rustling again from upstairs, followed by footsteps, made me stop. The presence I felt in the house was no longer just Camilla's, but something else, something strange. And the footsteps were not coming from the storm. Camilla whispered to me that something wasn't right. My senses were alert. Something inside me told me we should leave. but something else, an invisible force, kept me there. Then I heard the laughter, low, throaty, but clearly audible. It was at that moment that Camilla looked at me, her eyes full of tears, and confessed something I never imagined. "He's not a thief," she told me, her voice cracking. "It is him, the man who has haunted me since that night." A shiver ran through my body. I knew who he meant. It was a man from Camilla's past, a man she had never spoken to me about, but whose shadow had been present in her life. A man whose image came to my mind like a flash, and fear came over me. I couldn't fully grasp it until the front door slammed shut, as if an invisible force had pushed it inward. The footsteps upstairs grew louder. Laughter. That laughter filled the house. The real nightmare was about to begin. While the storm continued its furious dance outside, a heavy stillness had settled in the house. The echoes of footsteps upstairs were no longer just sounds, but palpable presences, seeming to crawl along the walls. The darkness was not coming from outside, but from inside the house itself, from those dark corners of the human soul that one sometimes insists on ignoring. It's funny how the mind tends to make fun of itself, to convince us that we are prepared for the worst, for the unpredictable, until we face it face to face. I used to think that the things that happen in stories are just that, stories. And yet there I was, trapped in a reality where lies and truth were intertwined in a dark abyss. The false alarm, the momentary fear at the possibility of imminent danger, had led me here. But in the end, it was my own ignorance, my lack of understanding about Camilla's past that had really put us in danger. We insist on ignoring the shadows, on believing that what we do not see does not exist, when in reality there are dangerous people living much closer than we would like to think, in memories, in decisions we do not make, in untold stories. Sometimes there is no rational explanation for evil. There is not always a thief, not always a tangible intruder that we can identify and stop. Sometimes the real terror is knowing that there are darker forces that feed on what we keep silent, that lurk in the most unpredictable moments, unveiling our worst vulnerabilities. Today I learned that there are no false alarms, but moments when the truth, the one we never wanted to see, finally catches up with us no matter what we thought we knew. I had decided that I needed a break, a change of air, something to take me out of the confinement of work, the daily routine and the days of insomnia. I'm not much of an outdoorsy person, but that special afternoon the storm seemed like the perfect excuse to get out into the woods. I needed clarity, and the sound of the rain falling on the leaves, the rumbling of the thunder and the thick fog swirling through the trees promised me something I couldn't find in the city: solitude and complete calm. The afternoon began cloudy and the first drops began to fall just as I was finishing packing my backpack. The forecast had predicted rain, but I never imagined that the storm would be as violent as it was. At that moment, there was no turning back. Next to me, my hiking boots rested ready for the trail, and the shelter I had reserved halfway up was my goal. According to the map, it wouldn't be a long trek. About 3 hours of hiking to the nearest shelter, then a few beers, a blanket, and a comic book awaited me. Something relaxing. Just what I was looking for. I stepped onto the trail, under the storm, and nature showed itself in all its fury. The wind began to howl through the trees. Raindrops fell like penetrating rocks on my skin. Despite the discomfort, something in me felt a strange peace, as if the noise of the world was fading away with every step I took. I had barely walked a half hour when I realized that the storm had worsened, with rain pelting my face and gusts of wind pushing me backwards, but I didn't care. I was alone in my element, or so I thought at the time. That's when I heard the first noise that made me stop. It wasn't thunder, nor the rustling of branches. It was a strange sound, like a whisper. I looked around, but the rain was lashing so hard that I could barely see beyond a short distance. I thought it might be the wind playing with the forest. But then I heard it again, this time closer, as if someone was moving through the trees. I tensed, but decided to keep walking. The last thing I wanted was for my mind to play tricks on me. Sometimes isolation plays tricks with perceptions, but the noise persisted, like soft footsteps, barely perceptible, but there. And it wasn't the wind. I was sure of that. I felt there was something or someone watching me. Discomfort washed over me, and the idea of returning to the car seemed more and more appealing. However, as if my own sense of adventure was getting in the way, I decided to continue. The trail narrowed and the wind began to blow harder, almost pushing me to the edge of the road. Then I saw a figure in the distance. At first I thought it was an illusion, a shadow confused by the rain. But when the figure took a step toward me, I saw it was a woman. Tall, not so thin, dressed in a thin jacket that barely protected her from the rain, her face hidden by a hood. She had no backpack or hiking gear. Just her, standing in the middle of the storm. At that moment, it struck me as very strange. "Are you lost?" I shouted at her, trying to make my voice sound firmer than I felt. The woman raised her head but didn't respond, and that really upset me. She just looked at me with dark, empty, piercing eyes. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried not to let it show. "Can I help you?" I insisted, taking a step toward her. Of course, I was too afraid. She made no move. Her silence was unsettling. And worst of all, something in her presence made me feel that I was not alone. As if she was watching me, evaluating me, waiting for something. She finally asked me, "Do you have a shelter nearby?" In his hoarse voice, as if he had been talking for hours in the middle of the storm. My breathing became irregular. That question was strange. If I was lost, how did I know of the existence of a shelter? There were no other shelters nearby on the map. I was actually a little dismayed. I replied, "Yes, it's about 2 hours from here, further up, but it's not a public place." My instinct told me that I should leave immediately, but the woman remained silent, and for a moment I thought she was going to leave. However, her eyes seemed to follow me, watching me intently. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Something was not right. The way she watched me, the way she seemed unaffected by the storm, my skin crawled. The woman wasn't from this place. Something about her didn't fit the environment. Finally, the woman spoke, this time with a calmness that made me even more uneasy. I thought, what happened? She doesn't have the same tone of voice anymore. She asked me if she could come with me, that her car was in the back, on the trail, that she was lost and it could get cold if she continued to wait by herself. Her tone was soft, but there was a determination hidden behind those words. A car. Something didn't make sense. There couldn't be a car in the middle of the woods. At that moment, the bad feeling I had been ignoring became an alarm blaring in my head. But before I could respond, the woman took a step toward me. Up close, I noticed something else strange. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hands, thin and long, trembled slightly. The storm was lashing her body without seeming to affect her. My instinct screamed at me to stay away, but I didn't. For some reason, the need to get out of there to find a safe place overcame any logic. I replied that it was okay to come with me, assuring her that she would be safer. I said so, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. She nodded without speaking, and we started walking together in the rain. As we moved forward, the noise of the storm became more deafening, but the silence between us was even heavier. My mind kept turning over unanswered questions. Why was he there? Why was he talking to me about a car that didn't exist, or at least I didn't see it? Every step toward the shelter filled me with a growing uneasiness. Suddenly, something made me stop. A distant sound, but it filtered through the thunder. They were voices, murmurs, as if someone else was nearby. I turned to the woman. "Do you hear that?" I asked her, my voice trembling a little. She didn't answer. She just turned her head toward the same spot, her face expressionless. The sound was getting clearer. There were more people, as several voices could be heard, and they were too close. "Who are they?" My voice sounded more urgent than I thought it would. The woman stared at me, her face expressionless again, and slowly she said, "Don't worry about them, they are not from your world." At that moment, I understood that something had gone wrong. Something had broken in the space around us. The voices seemed to be getting closer, and the atmosphere was getting denser, as if the storm itself was surrounding us. My mind began to race in all directions. Something was about to happen, something dark. The woman no longer seemed so distant, so indifferent to the storm. Her face was closer to mine, her breath warm against my ear. I turned suddenly. I saw several figures emerging through the fog, human shadows moving quickly like specters in the storm. Some were moving toward us, others farther back as if waiting for something. They could not be travelers. They couldn't be normal. The woman smiled strangely, with something in her eyes that was no longer indifferent but a mixture of hunger and desperation, telling me not to worry, that they will find me. And when they do, there will be no turning back. In that instant, the truth hit me like a bolt of lightning. The storm wasn't the only thing around us. There was something else, something darker than the rain itself, than the fog. The woman was no longer just a missing person. She was part of something, part of a game, a ritual that I had fallen into without realizing it. And for some reason, I could no longer move. Sometimes when we seek to escape the weight of the world, we believe that solitude is our ally, that distance will bring clarity or at least rest. But in reality, darkness is never far away. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we are safe, that the worst is behind us. The truth is, however, that danger often lurks where we least expect it, disguised as calm, normalcy, even kindness. We lie to ourselves believing that the storm outside is more dangerous than the storm within. And when the fog clears, we discover that monsters don't always have faces, claws, or fangs. Sometimes they are simply people who cross our path at the wrong time, in the wrong place. I know now that in the end, there is no real refuge. There is no safe place when human darkness has decided to find us. And worst of all, I no longer know if I really want to escape. I am incomplete since this happened to me. The rain has always been a fascinating refuge for me. Isn't it curious how the sound of the water hitting the windows and the murmur of the drops falling on the asphalt can create such an enveloping atmosphere? There is something extraordinarily comforting about that grayish serenity that seems to push everything else aside, a comfort I have longed for deeply. But that night was really different. It all started with a sharp pain in my side, as if something was shooting through me. But oddly enough, it wasn't as violent as a knife. It was more of a burning sensation, something deep that refused to fade away. At first I thought it would be just a passing discomfort, of no great importance, but to my surprise the pain not only persisted but intensified, as if an invisible pressure was pressing down on my abdomen. I got up from the chair, intrigued, and walked towards the apartment door. But when I tried to reach for the phone, something strange happened. I felt dizzy. Why did the colors in the room start to blend together? My head was spinning, and in an almost instinctive act, I managed to dial the emergency number, asking for help. What was really happening? The phone seemed far away, but my anxiety made me speak quickly. I could barely articulate the words, feeling the swaying of my body and the pain that would not let up. As the ambulance arrived, I was disconnected from everything, amidst the voices of the paramedics and the feeling of being swept through a dark sea. The next thing I remember is arriving at the hospital, exhausted, without strength. My body exhausted, my hands cold, my eyes heavy. A doctor with a grave face received me in the emergency room, and before I lost consciousness, they asked me my name and my age while they laid me down on a stretcher. I woke up in a white room, surrounded by tubes and wires. How strange. My skin burned as if I had been in boiling water, although the pain, surprisingly, was a subdued companion thanks to the medication. I tried to move, but my body seemed to be trapped in an incredibly overwhelming weight. What was happening? Something didn't fit, but the fog of anesthesia kept me in a state of confusion. Suddenly, a nurse entered the room. Her presence was distant and professional, but there was something in her gaze that I couldn't miss, a restlessness that she struggled to hide. She asked me how I was feeling, but before I could articulate a response, she left, leaving me in an eerie silence. The door closed softly, and I was left alone with my thoughts and the sound of the rain pattering on the window. Why was his attitude so strange to me? It was as if I was being ignored, as if the attention I so craved was slipping through my fingers. What was really going on? Hours later, the doctor came in. He was a tall man with a perfectly trimmed beard and a grave look, almost straight out of a magazine. Despite his calm tone, something about his presence made me uneasy. The light from the lamp on him cast shadows that crept across his face, giving him a spectral appearance. He asked me how I felt. I replied that I was still in pain, and asked him to explain what had happened. His response was cold and distant, almost as if he were talking about a routine operation. He told me that I had had to have an emergency operation due to a perforation in my bowel. a rather serious situation that, if not taken care of in time, could have been life-threatening. However, something in his words made me frown. Why wasn't I informed of this before the operation? Why wasn't I told anything until this moment? The doctor was silent for a moment, looking at me with an intensity that made me curious. The tension in the atmosphere was almost palpable. Finally, he broke the silence with an explanation that did not quite convince me. There was no time. The most important thing was to save you. The damaged organs were removed, but the rest is fine. However, it is essential that you have a constant follow-up. What did that really mean? What else was behind this sudden intervention? A question, a simple doubt arose in my mind. Why was he talking to me that way? As if something else had been removed. My instinct told me that something didn't fit. But before I could ask more, the doctor turned and said goodbye without giving me a chance to deepen the conversation. He left me alone again, but the restlessness grew with each passing second. The hours seemed to drag on. The rain kept falling, hitting the window, like a metaphor of what was brewing inside me, something I could not understand. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, I was seized by an inexplicable need to get up. Even though my body was still sore, a burning curiosity pushed me forward. What was beyond this place? I unhooked the cables that kept me connected to the machines, and with a titanic effort, I stood up. Each step toward the door was a small challenge, but the anguish and unease I felt was more powerful than any physical discomfort. I had to find answers. Opening the door, I found a deserted hallway, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The silence was overwhelming, interrupted only by the distant murmur of machines and the constant pattering of rain. I took a few steps forward, but something made me stop in my tracks. At the end of the corridor, a half-open door let out a ray of yellowish light that seemed to invite me. Without a second thought, I headed for it, driven by a mixture of fear and an insatiable need to discover what secrets were hidden behind that threshold. What mystery was there? Pushing open the door, I found a small room that looked like a makeshift laboratory. On the table rested various medical instruments, vials of oddly colored liquids, and what looked like a dossier of medical information. But what paralyzed me was not so much what I saw, but what I heard over the room's intercoms. The patient's reaction is positive. He shows no signs of rejection yet, but his body responds slowly. He is a good specimen. We can proceed with the plan, said the doctor's voice, that cold, calculated voice I had heard before. My heart began to pound. I froze, not daring to breathe. Something was not right. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. The doctor appeared in the doorway, his gaze fixed and calculating. His face was no longer friendly or professional. Something in his expression made me understand what he had done. He had put me in a place I couldn't get out of. Before I could even utter a word, he took my arm and led me towards the operating table. How strange. The room, which had once looked like a normal laboratory, had now metamorphosed into an eerie nightmare scenario. "I'm sorry," he murmured with a softness that sounded like an apology. "But you can't leave," he said. "You know, we still have a lot of work to do. What could be going on here?" The door closed behind him with a dull thud, and the sound of the rain, which had once been my refuge, now sounded like the prelude to something much darker. Something I could not escape. I could not move, I could not scream. But what terrified me most was that it all seemed so planned, as if my life had been nothing more than a piece in a puzzle that I didn't understand. And then I knew. The operation had not been to save me. It had been just the beginning. Now that I am here in some corner of the hospital with scars on my body reminding me of what has happened to me, I can't help but think that I am still alive, albeit in a way that is strange to me. My breathing is slower, my body feels different, incomplete. There are parts of me that are gone, organs that someone decided I didn't need and that I didn't even know I had lost. The operation has left its mark, not only on my skin, but also on my mind. Yet here I am, breathing, feeling, thinking. It is amazing how life can turn around in a second. In the midst of pain, one clings to the essentials. Survival. I'm here, but I'm not sure if it's by my strength, by luck, or simply by a whim of fate. No one can explain to me how it is possible that I am still breathing, how a body that has suffered so much is still functioning. Every morning when I wake up, I look at myself in the mirror and feel that I am a shadow of what I used to be. Life offered me a second chance, but I don't know how to take advantage of it. I'm here, it's true, but I'm not the same person I used to be. I'm alive, but I feel like I'm missing something essential. And maybe that's what hurts me the most, to recognize that what defined me is no longer there. I am alive, yes, but at a price I can't quite understand. Perhaps what surprises me most is that despite all that I have lost, I still question whether it was worth it to go on. I don't have a definitive answer. The only thing I know for sure is that, for now, I'm still here. And maybe that's the most important thing. The delivery that changed my life. The rain was lashing hard against my helmet, but visibility was not a problem. The motorcycle roared through the empty streets of Madrid, headlights illuminating the wet streets while the wind from the storm whipped my face. The city, for the most part, seemed to have surrendered to the storm, but I kept moving. I couldn't stop. That was the rule in my job. I am a food delivery man, and that day, like any other, I had the obligation to deliver my last order for the day. The bike, although already a bit old, was still running perfectly, and the GPS indicated that I only had a few minutes left to get there. The order was from a family living in a luxurious apartment complex north of the city. The place was in an exclusive area, but that didn't surprise me. I've delivered food to mansions, luxury apartments, places where people with money don't worry about what they spend. What did catch my attention was the strange tone of the call, but I continued with my work anyway. "It's critical that I get there fast," the voice on the other end of the phone told me. It was the same voice that gave me the precise address. It wasn't the first time I had been asked for speed, but there was something in its tone that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes people ordered food at the last minute, hoping that it would arrive on time, and that was quite common. I didn't give the matter any more thought. I was driving down the main avenue, wet and lonely, when I passed a park where the trees were bending under the weight of the rain. The storm had already darkened the city, and everything was shrouded in oppressive gloom. As I neared my destination, the GPS led me to an alley that led to an even more exclusive area, a luxury apartment complex with glass walls, perfectly manicured gardens, and tall buildings with breathtaking views. I parked the bike next to the entrance. The wind and rain seemed to have increased in intensity, and for a moment, I thought how nice it would be to go home. But I had a delivery to make, and that was all that mattered. I got off the bike, grabbed the bag with the groceries, and headed for the front door, an elegant lobby with automatic glass doors. Through the glass, I saw the doorman, a man with a serious face who didn't seem to notice my presence. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. I rang again, more insistently. A few seconds later, the door opened. The man, with an expressionless expression, gestured for me to enter. He didn't say a word to me. He just closed the door behind me without making the slightest noise. I felt as if I had entered a world apart. The entrance was quiet, quieter than I expected. Everything about the place seemed perfectly timed, from the fresh smell of the air conditioning to the immaculate sheen of the surfaces. I passed down a long hallway that extended into a sort of common room. Everything was so perfect, so carefully ordered, that I felt like an intruder. My heart began to pound harder, but I tried to ignore it. I moved on. The doorman did not accompany me. Instead, an elevator opened without me pressing any buttons. Something inside me told me that I shouldn't get in, that I should turn around and leave. But common sense prevailed. It was only one delivery, and I couldn't afford to waste time. The elevator rose slowly, the cables creaking and the metallic echo filling the air. When we reached the top floor, the elevator door opened with a dull click. In front of me, a long hallway that seemed to have no end. The lights were dimmed and the sound of rain on the roof echoed loudly. I walked down the hallway. My breathing was becoming more agitated, and the feeling that something was wrong was only growing. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It was not closed, but slightly ajar. Something about that crack gave me the creeps. The door shouldn't be open, or at least not like that. I advanced towards it, but before I could touch it, I heard a laugh. A low, barely audible sound coming from inside the room. Something didn't fit, but I forced myself to move forward. I pushed the door. Fearfully, but I pushed it. The first impression was of a quiet, cozy home. which contrasted sharply with the sense of danger that was seizing me. A family was gathered around a large dining table. There was a woman in her 30s, elegant, with her hair in a neat updo, and a man in his 40s, with a hardened face, a neatly trimmed beard, and a steady gaze. The son, who appeared to be in his teens, was at the end of the table, silently watching me. What struck me was how calmly I was greeted. No one said a word, not even the woman, who looked at me with eyes that could not have been colder. The tension in the air was surprising. I stood still in the doorway, not knowing what to do. The food, I told him, raising the bag as if that might break the ice. The man stood up slowly, as if everything was in a well-rehearsed script. He took the bag from my hand unhurriedly and left it on the table without saying a word. Next to him, the son kept staring at me as if studying my every move. The woman smiled, a too forced smile which did not reach her eyes. It was an empty smile, as if she was calculating something. At that moment, the woman asked me in a soft voice, "Would you like to stay and eat with us?" What at first seemed like a polite invitation seemed to me more like a veiled threat. My instincts told me that something was wrong, that I should leave as soon as possible. However, something kept me there, immobile, as if an invisible force was holding me back. "Thank you, but I must go," I replied, although my voice sounded hesitant. The woman did not seem surprised. She simply nodded and again smiled. The smile never reached her face. It always seemed to remain on the surface, like a mask hiding something much darker. It was at that moment that I heard something strange. A thud, as if something was moving upstairs. A shadow crossed the nearby window. In my mind, I connected it to something that had disturbed me from the beginning. The fact that I had heard no sound from the street, no car, no noise from the storm. The building seemed isolated, too isolated. At one point, the man insisted that I stay with his deeper voice this time. I turned to him, feeling that I could no longer trust my own senses. I looked at the son, who was still staring at me, his eyes empty of emotion. Something in his gaze told me I was missing something important, something I could not see. I repeated, this time more firmly, "No, really, I must go." The woman raised a hand gently, and at that moment, the son rose from the table. His steps were soft but determined. Something inside me clicked. They weren't going to let me go, and if I stayed one more minute, there might be no way to get out of there alive. A shiver ran down my spine. I quickly turned around and ran out the door. But before I could reach the hallway, the son blocked my way. His face was expressionless, almost empty again. A hand gesture made me stop in my tracks. At this point, he told me calmly that I could not leave. For a second, I stood there, paralyzed, unable to do anything. I felt a pressure in my chest as if the air was getting thicker, heavier. I was trapped. The man who had been standing at the table took a step toward me. His eyes were cold, calculating. I knew I had crossed a line I should not have crossed. I knew I was no longer in control. He told me firmly that I had to stay in a tone that left no room for further objection. The exit door was right in front of me, but I wouldn't get to it. Not if I didn't want something much worse than losing my job to happen to me. I remember the sound of footsteps approaching from across the room. The last image I have of that family was of them smiling at me. But this time, their smile was much crueler. The rain continued to fall outside while I understood too late that not every home is a shelter. Since that night, everything has changed. The city, with its wet streets and buildings glistening in the rain, no longer feels the same. Before, being a delivery driver was just part of my daily routine, something almost automatic. I worried about being on time, following the right route and making sure deliveries went smoothly. But now, every package I carry on my bike and every bell I ring has become a challenge. A sign that not everything that seems normal really is. Now I'm more cautious. At first, I didn't understand why the smallest details would cause me to worry. The tone of a customer's voice, an address that seems a little far away, or an unusual silence behind a closed door. Each of these signs makes me doubt. Before, I thought the only thing that mattered was speed. Now, what really counts for me is being attentive, not letting my guard down even for an instant. I know that the world is not as perfect as the ads make it out to be, nor are deliveries as easy as the brochures say they are. There are hidden realities that are not visible to the naked eye, but are always present, waiting for their chance. My job is not just about getting a pizza or a package from one place to another. Now, it's a matter of survival. That's why, every time I start the bike, I make sure my mind is sharp. In this job, and in life in general, you can't rely solely on appearances. If you're not sure who you're really giving your trust to, it's better not to give anything at all. This has been going on for some time now, and it still disturbs my peace. The rain was falling furiously that afternoon. It pounded everything in its path, making the sound of the impact mingle with the thunder, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. Still, I decided to go. I had no other plan for that Friday. It had been so long since I had seen my grandmother, and her voice on the phone had made me feel the need to visit her, to keep her company. Sometimes the years take us away without us realizing it, and I had realized that it was time to remedy that. I left the car in the driveway of her house, a place far from the city, in the middle of nowhere. As soon as I closed the door, I felt the weight of the atmosphere on me, that strange feeling you sometimes get when you arrive in places where time seems to have stopped. Grandma's house was old, with small windows overlooking the garden, and a solid wooden door that creaked when you opened it with a worn golden color. I had never been so worried about the rain. But today I couldn't stop thinking about the uncomfortable feeling that came over me as I approached. At first, I thought it was just the storm, the gloomy atmosphere, but something told me it wasn't just that. As I slowly approached the door, I saw something strange. The light inside the house was off, but a shadow was moving in the living room window. Restless movements as if someone was walking around. It wasn't my grandmother. She wasn't moving with such agility anymore. I was pretty sure of that. I stood in the doorway, listening intently. From inside there came a low murmur, a kind of conversation. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unpleasant. Something prompted me to push the door cautiously. I stepped inside without making a sound. My first impression of the house was one of total disorder. The curtains were poorly closed, the lights were off, and the entrance was covered with dust, something unusual in that house. The room to which the living room led was on the left, and it was from there that the murmur was coming. The only thing I could clearly make out was the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, as if someone was dragging something or someone. I moved forward cautiously. My breathing was the only thing I could hear apart from the storm. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to alert whoever was there. Something wasn't right. When I reached the corner of the door, I saw a scene that made the air in my lungs freeze. My grandmother, in her usual dress but her face pale, her eyes wild, was looking up at the man in front of her. His back was turned, but his posture was unsettling, like that of a predator stalking its prey. He wore no jacket or coat despite the cold, and his face was partially covered by a cap, but I could see his eyes. They were cold and inhuman. I don't know what prompted me to act, but the first impulse was to approach and get the stranger's attention. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't open my mouth. I was paralyzed. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. My grandmother, sitting in a chair, was not moving, her face marked with a very deep fear. It wasn't the kind of fear she used to have, a quiet worry about the little things in life, but a tangible dread, as if she had seen something she could never escape. And then I understood. That man was not there by chance. He was not just any visitor. He was not a friend, not a distant relative. He was something much darker. Suddenly, the scene was broken by the sound of a thud. The man took a step backward, dropped something on the floor, a knife, a screwdriver. I didn't know what it was, and turned toward where I was standing. It was too late to realize that he had already seen me. He stepped forward. The tension in the air could be cut. I could see his lips curl into a smirk, as if everything was under his control. My grandmother tried to move, but her body was unresponsive, and I realized she wasn't there by accident. There was something else about her that prevented her from moving, as if fear had left her paralyzed. My mind began to quickly process what was happening, and I realized something frightening. I was alone. There was no one else there to help me. No police, no neighbors, no one, just him, my grandmother, and me. It was a tremendous shock. The man started walking towards me. A couple of seconds passed, but for me, it was an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, as if he was speaking through a mask. The man at that moment told me I shouldn't have gone. His words were simple, but the tone of his voice was so somber that it froze my blood completely. I tried to step back, but my body didn't react right away. My muscles tensed, trying to move, to escape, but confusion kept me paralyzed. I looked around, searching for something that could help me. At that moment, he was so close that I could smell the scent of sweat on his skin. I felt his presence so intensely that it seemed that his proximity was destabilizing me. At that instant, my mind began to formulate a plan, something that could save us both. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. Without thinking too much, I took a step to the side and pushed a table that was nearby. The man stumbled and fell to the floor, but he didn't stop. He got up quickly, a fury in his eyes. I knew I didn't have much time. My grandmother was still motionless, unable to help me. It was as if fear had trapped her in her own body. I could not leave her there alone. I could not let her be the next victim. The man now looked at me with a very intense hatred. He was not willing to let me escape. I tried to reason, to talk. I told him we didn't know who he was, that we had nothing to do with him. But he just smiled, a crooked smile, as if it was all just a game to him. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could almost hear the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. "You'll never understand," he told me, his voice even lower, almost a whisper. Suddenly he jumped toward me and I could see his hands clench into a fist. I felt a sharp blow to my side. The air escaped my lungs and I fell to the ground with a choked scream. But at that moment, something inside me activated. Fear was not going to stop me. I jumped up and grabbed the first thing I saw, an old lamp lying on a nearby table. Without thinking, I threw it with all my might at his face. The impact disoriented him for a moment, and that split second was all I needed to push the table between us and run to my grandmother. I grabbed her hand tightly and dragged her along, oblivious to the pain or the fear. The man, still staggering, started to get up, but it was too late. I couldn't stop now. I knew my only chance was to escape. The door was a few feet away, and although the sound of the rain was deafening, my heart was beating so loud it seemed like the whole world could hear it. I ran like never before. I was about to leave when I felt a pressure on my arm. It was him again. But this time he wouldn't dare come closer. The sound of a car braking violently interrupted the moment. I watched as the police, alerted by a neighbor, arrived on the scene. The man, seeing the arrival of the officers, realized that his time had run out. In a last-ditch attempt, he tried to run into the darkness of the garden, but it was too late. In a matter of seconds, he was apprehended. We took the grandmother to the hospital. Although physically and emotionally broken, she survived. I'm still trying to process what happened that night, but of one thing I am sure. I will never set foot in that house again as long as it rains. I felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief because I no longer had to fear for my life or my grandmother's life. Anger because that man had destroyed our lives. From that moment on, life returned to a certain normalcy. But the emotional scars took a long time to heal. Every time I saw an older woman alone, I felt the need to protect her. The rain, once a soothing sound, now reminded me of that terrible night. Years later, my grandmother passed away. At her funeral, as I looked at her coffin, I realized that I had never fully forgiven myself for what had happened. But I also knew that she would always love me, no matter what. The rain continued to fall, relentless, on the cemetery, and I, in the cold rain, vowed that I would never again allow anyone to hurt someone I loved. The night I spent at my grandmother's house taught me a lesson I never thought I would learn. Sometimes, the real danger is not in the unknown or in the shadows we imagine. The real terror comes from our own human frailty, our fears, our choices, our weaknesses. Human beings are capable of the noblest, but also of the darkest. I've always believed that what frightens us most are ghosts or creatures that appear in our nightmares, but in reality, the most terrifying thing is people. Our ability to hurt others, to ruin lives out of selfishness or insanity, is what really defines us as human beings. The evil reflected in someone's face is what can terrify us the most. That night, as the rain pounded on the roof, I realized how fragile we are. I felt that everything I loved was about to fall apart. Sometimes violence doesn't just manifest itself physically, it can also be emotional. The real fear is not just being victimized by someone, but seeing what a person is capable of when dealing with their own pain. I had never felt so exposed, and for the first time I understood the importance of protecting those we love. The darkness is not only outside, it can also be inside us. The last camp of my life. This story is amazing. I remember the first time I heard about the camp on the old reservation. We all thought it would be an adventure. A summer in the middle of nature, surrounded by giant trees, dusty trails, and clear skies. Almost everyone in the group, we were teenagers. I, one of the younger leaders, had the opportunity to get out of the city for a few days and forget the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I thought it would be a worthwhile experience, a memory to last a lifetime. Nothing prepared me for what would happen that night. It all started out as an ordinary field trip. The kids had arrived at camp just 4 days ago, and despite the constant rain that seemed unwilling to let up, everyone was trying to make the most of the time. However, something was not right from the beginning. There was something strange in the air, a feeling that I couldn't identify, but that made me feel uncomfortable. Perhaps it was the constant gaze of Paolo, the head ranger, who was always watching us with piercing eyes from a distance. The first indication that something was wrong occurred when one of the children disappeared. Leonardo, a little boy of about 11, strayed from the group during a hike. No one thought it was serious at first. Children are prone to getting lost or separated for a moment in the woods. But when more than 2 hours passed and we still hadn't found him, a thick layer of anxiety began to envelop us. The storm began to intensify, as if the weather also sensed the bad omen in the air. Rain poured down torrentially, soaking our clothes and hampering our search. The slippery terrain and the trees, always moving in the wind, did not help. However, in the late afternoon, in the midst of this weather chaos, we found him. Leonardo was in a clearing near a stream that was barely distinguishable through the fog and rain. He was standing completely still, as if nothing was happening around him. His eyes, wide open, were staring at something fixed in the distance, something we could not see. He seemed paralyzed with fear, but the strangest thing was that he wasn't crying or asking for help. He was just looking at us, as if he was waiting for something, or rather, someone. I didn't really know what to think at that moment. We pulled him close, hugged him, and started walking back towards the camp with the feeling that something was not right. It was at that precise moment that we found them. A group of corpses. They were not there by accident or natural evil. They were arranged in an eerie way, in a circle, as if they were waiting for us to join them. All of them had their eyes open, but their bodies looked lifeless, abandoned by time. They were dirty, covered with dirt and fallen branches. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of rotting flesh and dampness. My mind could not process what I was seeing. I couldn't understand what it meant. But I knew it was no coincidence. Next to those bodies, there was a man. He was standing in the middle of it all, as if he wasn't out of place. He was wearing a thick leather jacket, worn by the years, and a wide-brimmed hat that covered his face. He said nothing as we approached, didn't even move. He simply watched us with an unsettling calmness. I remember his face as I looked, what I could see under the hat. It was the face of an older man, wrinkled, almost decrepit. But what terrified me most was not his appearance, but his smile. That crooked, forced smile that didn't seem to fit his face. "Don't come closer," someone whispered, without knowing who had said it. But it was too late. The man raised a hand and started walking into the woods. We didn't chase him. We didn't say a word. But something in his attitude paralyzed us, as if that was the moment when everything began to fall apart. When we returned to the camp, our uneasiness increased. We knew something had changed. The lights in the cabin flickered with every clap of thunder, as if they wanted to go out and leave us in the dark. The storm raged with more uncontrolled fury than ever. No one spoke about what we had seen, not a word. Just blank stares and a sense that something lurked beyond the shadows. That night, something else disappeared. Paolo, the chief ranger, didn't show up the next day. His radio had stopped working. We went looking for him, not knowing what to expect, but what we found was even stranger. Paolo was there, in the same clearing where we had found Leonardo. But he wasn't dead, nor was he alive. He was sitting, staring at the horizon. His face, a mask of despair, stared at us with empty eyes, as if he were trapped in a place none of us understood. His jacket was torn, covered in mud and blood. He had a blood-soaked machete at his side, but he made no move to get up or defend himself. He was just watching us, as if waiting for something. One of the boys, Juan, approached to try to talk to him. But as he tried to touch his shoulder, Paolo turned abruptly. His eyes glazed over and muttered something under his breath. "They're coming for all of us." We didn't know what to do. No one dared to come any closer. And at that precise moment, we understood that something far worse than a simple disappearance was raging in that place. As evening fell, the storm showed no sign of abating. The wind was pounding hard, shaking the trees, and the rain became an unstoppable torrent that surrounded us. We took shelter in the cabins, but the feeling of insecurity consumed us. As the hours passed, we began to notice that some of the other rangers were not at their posts either. This was not normal. Something was going on in the camp, something we could not explain. That night, while we were trying to rest, the noises started. Strange, low, coming from the darkness surrounding the camp. At first we thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. Someone or something was moving outside the hut. My companions woke up, and in a panic we began to prepare what we could to defend ourselves. The next morning, we found more evidence of what we feared. The corpses in the clearing were not alone. Now there were more bodies, more dead, more missing people. Some of the children we had lost in the search were gone. There was no trace of them, only the footprints left by the rain that vanished on contact with the muddy ground. Paranoia took hold of us. No one trusted anyone. No one could sleep. We knew that sooner or later the man in the leather jacket would return. And worst of all, we knew we were unprepared. One night, as the storm raged, we heard the sound of footsteps in the mud. They were slow, deliberate, and approaching the cabin. We stood in silence, shivering. No one dared to make a sound. But at that very moment, a piercing scream pierced the darkness. It was the scream of Laura, another monitor, who had been with us from the beginning. We ran outside, but it was too late. When we arrived, she was there, standing on the threshold of the forest, staring at a point in the distance. Her face was pale, her eyes as empty as those of the dead we had encountered. He did not say a word. He only whispered in a trembling voice, "He's here." The man was there, watching us from the shadows. He had come for all of us. And though there is still much to tell, I know the story will end the same way it began. With the storm, with the fear, with the lurking shadow, because the real horror did not come from the dead. The real horror came from the living. Sometimes the real danger is not in what we can see, nor in the fears our minds can create. What really terrifies is what remains hidden, what we cannot foresee. A shadow that lurks in the daily routine, or a smile that hides something much more disturbing. We never imagined that an experience as simple as camping could unleash something so terrifying. We felt invulnerable, comfortable in our routine, convinced that everything would go on as usual. However, the truth is that evil, madness, and chaos do not always present themselves abruptly. Sometimes they infiltrate the silence, like a storm that begins with a light drizzle, almost imperceptible, until it is too late to find shelter. Today, after what we experienced, I realize how unprepared we were. In the camp, no one had the necessary knowledge to face the unexpected. No one thought that danger could come from someone so close, from something so human and deceptive. Many times in life we feel safer than we really are. We get used to our routines, the rules, and the predictable, and forget what lurks in the shadows, what lurks at the edge of our comfort zone. The lesson is clear. Never underestimate what you cannot see. Don't expect danger to come when you decide it will. There is always something bigger and more threatening lurking, and when you finally face it, it may already be too late to prepare. That's why it never hurts to be alert. It never hurts to be prepared. Because sometimes, the worst enemy is not the one in front of you, but the one that has been behind you all along, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The night began like any other night when a group of friends get together to escape the routine, to forget the worries and laugh for a while. It had rained all day, and now, under the dark layer of the night sky, the streets of the city looked empty, reflecting the light from the street lamps reflected in the puddles. I didn't like driving in the rain, but I didn't want to be the one to stay home either. We gathered at Diego's house, a secluded place with a small garden where the sound of raindrops hitting the roof provided an almost mournful atmosphere. The group consisted of 5 people: me, Diego, Ernesto, Myra, and Javier. Of the 5 of us, I had always been the most skeptical. I didn't believe in superstitions, nor in weird stories about the occult or the strange. However, that night everything would change, and I had no idea how quickly and brutally my perception of reality would alter. We met at around 10 o'clock at night, each with our own drink in hand, ready to enjoy a night of chatting, games, and music. Within minutes, however, the conversation changed. Diego, who always had disturbing stories to tell, started talking about a legend he had heard at work. Something about a group of women who performed secret rituals in the darkness of the nearby woods. We laughed, of course. We knew Diego often exaggerated. But even so, the atmosphere had already become a bit tense. The rain was coming down hard on the roof, and the drops were hitting with such impetus that the sound enveloped us like an uncomfortable blanket. "It's not just a legend," Diego said with a somewhat strained smile. "I've heard that there's a place in the woods, not far from here, where some people have disappeared." Ernesto, who could never pass up an opportunity to challenge others, teased him. "What do you say we go to the woods tonight? I don't know, maybe we'll run into that group that is said to eat men." The laughter was general, but a strange feeling began to run down my back. Something in the rain, in the tense atmosphere of the night, made me uncomfortable. However, I tried to ignore it. We were at Diego's house, safe, laughing, drinking, nothing out of the ordinary. After a while, when the alcohol was starting to take its effect, Mayra made a proposal that none of us had seen coming. "I think we should go to that forest, to the place where they say these things happen. See if we can find something real, or at least something interesting." At first, the idea seemed absurd. We were in the middle of nowhere, under a storm that seemed to have no end, and I honestly didn't see why we should risk walking through a forest late at night. However, everyone was enthusiastic about the idea, and in the end, it ended up being a challenge of sorts. Mayra, as always, led the conversation with her bold and provocative attitude, while the rest of us got carried away, driven by alcohol and an inexplicable desire to prove that we were braver than the stories Diego was telling us. The walk to the forest was short, but when we arrived, I immediately felt uncomfortable. The air was thick and humid, the rain now so heavy that it seemed like a curtain covering everything. At that moment, I felt like my instincts were screaming at me that I should leave, but I couldn't turn back. I didn't want to be the one to break the group's spirit of adventure. We walked in silence along the soggy trail. The trees loomed around us like shadows watching us. There was nothing but rain, rustling branches, and distant thunder. It didn't take us long to reach a clearing in the forest, where a circle of stones was laid out on the ground, surrounded by fallen branches and dry leaves. Javier asked what that was, looking around, confused and somewhat frightened. "Probably just an abandoned place," I answered, though I wasn't so sure. Something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, and the feeling of being watched intensified with each passing second. Diego began to laugh nervously, saying, "See, this is where they say those weird things happen." Just as he was about to say something else, we heard the sound of footsteps, quick footsteps, coming from the darkness of the forest. We all fell silent, tense, our ears alert. Then from among the trees, 3 women emerged. They were all dressed in dark clothing, with cloaks that the thunder made flutter like ghosts in the gloom. They did not look lost or frightened. They moved with an eerie calmness, and their eyes, gleaming in the light of the lanterns, stared at us. One of them, the one in the center, stepped forward and looked at us with a smile that was not at all friendly. "What are you doing here?" she asked in a soft but firm voice, as if it were a rhetorical question. Mayra, who looked braver than ever, stepped forward with a defiant smile. "That we were just exploring, looking for something interesting." The women were silent for a moment, and then the woman in the center told us that this was not a place for the curious, that it was only a place for those who are meant to be here. That sentence gave me a chill. I couldn't help but look at the others, but no one seemed to want to back away. Something in the woman's words made me feel as if we were already trapped in something, as if fate had dragged us there without us knowing it. Ernesto asked her what they wanted from us, of course, somewhat nervously. The woman smiled a little more, but her smile now had a more distant, almost threatening air. Nothing anymore. That we didn't need to do anything. That we were already there. Suddenly, the air seemed to become thicker, as if an invisible pressure was upon us. I felt the ground beneath my feet become more slippery, as if the rain had made it more unstable. But worst of all was the feeling that these women knew more about us than we knew about them. Without warning, the women moved quickly, surrounding us in a circle. They didn't seem in a hurry, but the fact that they moved like shadows without making a sound made fear begin to creep up my spine. The woman in the center said, "Listen to me well," approaching me with a terrifying calmness. "You are here because you are part of us, not because you chose to be. There is no way to leave now." My heart began to pound. I wanted to move, but my feet were paralyzed. It was as if the ground itself was trapping me. At that moment, one of the nearby trees rustled loudly and a flash of lightning illuminated the entire clearing. The women, who up to that moment seemed calm, began to move with unnatural speed. One of them approached Myra, who screamed and tried to run, but the others quickly stopped her. The three women held her tightly, and Myra's expression changed from surprise to terror. I shouted at them to let her go, but my voice came out weak, broken with fear. The woman in front of me smiled with a calmness that chilled my blood. "Nothing you say matters now. It's too late now." At that moment, I understood that this was no mere game or macabre joke. We were in the middle of something very dark, something we could neither understand nor control. Time seemed to have stopped. Mayra struggled in vain. The rest of us watched, paralyzed, unable to move. The sound of the rain on the trees joined the sound of my heartbeat, but that no longer mattered. The storm was nothing compared to what had begun. The women approached Myra with rituals I didn't understand, but didn't need to understand to know it wasn't a game. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the feeling that my body was no longer responding, was how the shadows of the trees lengthened towards us, while the women murmured words in a language I did not understand, but which I was sure I was not supposed to hear. The storm continued, as if nothing had changed. But we never came back. Looking back, what resonates with me most is a hard lesson. Recklessness is not a game. Courage is not just about venturing into the unknown, but having the wisdom to recognize our limits and pay attention to those voices that alert us when something isn't right. The night in the woods, the pouring rain, the women who were gone. It wasn't a challenge or an exciting story, it was a warning, a reality that we struggled to accept until it was too late. Like many before us, we were carried away by the impulse of youth, alcohol, and that feeling of invulnerability that sometimes makes us believe we are invincible. We wanted to prove that we were fearless and that we could face what others avoided. But over time, I learned that real danger doesn't always present itself in obvious ways. Often it lies in what we ignore, in what we don't understand, in the places we choose to explore without thinking about what might happen. I now understand that it doesn't pay to act recklessly. There are places we shouldn't go, times when it is wiser to turn away, and advice that is better to listen to. At the end of the day, the most valuable thing we have is life, and no adventure is worth risking it. The rain was hitting the window so hard that the sound was almost deafening, as if the whole sky had decided to empty itself over the city. The wind filtered through the cracks, bringing with it the humidity that settled in every corner of the house. All I could hear was the roar of the storm. Yet despite all that noise, there was a restlessness in my chest that I couldn't ignore, a strange need calling me to go outside. At that time, I lived in a secluded neighborhood where the streets, though busy during the day, became deserted at night. Like most locals, I rarely went out after dark, especially on a night like that. However, there was something in the air that pushed me to grab my keys and go for a walk. I needed to clear my mind. The rain wouldn't stop. The city, shrouded in a dull gray, looked even drearier under the storm. I walked along the sidewalk with the collar of my coat pulled up, trying to cover myself from the water splashing on my face. My footsteps echoed in the solitude, accompanied only by the sound of thunder. I passed in front of the small square that was always empty at that hour, and that's when I saw her. At first I thought it was an illusion of the rain, a blurry figure blurring through the fog. But as I got closer, I could clearly make out a little girl, about 10 or 12 years old, standing under a tree, hugging herself as if trying not to succumb to the cold. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, not looking at anyone. She made no noise, just stood there, motionless. My first impulse was to approach her to offer help. Isn't it curious to see someone so young on a deserted street at that hour? And even more so in the middle of a storm like the one that was raging that night. The girl raised her head slowly as she noticed my presence, and her expression was so vacant, almost as if she wasn't really there. I wondered what she could be thinking. Her large eyes reflected a strange coldness, and I noticed that her body was trembling. Why was she wearing such shabby clothes? Had she been on the street for so long? The situation left me with a myriad of questions. Something in her gaze and haunting smile made me sense that something wasn't right, but I decided to ignore the feeling and move closer. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the distance, making me tense up. The girl kept that strange smile as if she was waiting for something. At that moment, a tall man appeared behind her, wrapped in a long coat that made him look even more intimidating in the middle of the storm. I didn't notice his presence until his low, calm, but authoritative voice broke the silence. What a surprise. Tension completely enveloped me. I could not believe that I was face to face with someone on that deserted street. The man, his face half hidden under a hood, had such a cold expression that he almost seemed to be from another world. His gaze, penetrating and analytical, seemed to be assessing something in me. What was going on here? The situation was getting stranger and stranger. Even though a part of me wanted to take a step back, there was something that kept me there, caught up in this story. And the girl, who at first seemed so vulnerable, was now becoming even more disconcerting with the presence of this stranger. What was going to happen? When I tried to excuse myself and turn away, oh, what a surprise. The man raised a hand, as if he had a special power to stop me. He gestured to me with a coldness that left me intrigued, suggesting that it would be best for me to be on my way if I didn't want complications. Her tone was so clear that I could almost feel the pressure in the air. There would be no second chance to ask. So, I looked at the girl one last time, and what do you think? She didn't look scared at all. Her smile, though a little strange, now had an air of satisfaction, as if she was really enjoying what was happening. What was going on here? So much mystery in a single moment. Just as I decided to turn around, I felt a hand clutch my shoulder tightly. The tug was so sharp that I almost fell to the ground. The man reached over, holding me tightly, and in an icy whisper in my ear, told me that they knew what I was thinking, what I was doing, and that there was no escape for me. The pressure on my shoulder increased, and before I could react, he pushed me to the sidewalk, sending me tumbling down. I tried to get up, but the pain in my leg prevented me. From the ground, I watched the girl approach slowly, with a chilling decisiveness in her stride. The man was watching her from behind, and something in his expression made it clear to me that she was not a victim, but a key player in the whole thing. What a disturbing discovery. The realization perplexed me. This was no ordinary criminal, a robbery, a common kidnapping, no, nothing like that. I was being hunted, as if I were an animal. And most disconcerting of all, the girl was not the victim. She was the bait. A cunning lure designed to attract the unwary like me, those who would stop to offer their help. It was at that moment, with growing terror, that I began to understand that she was part of something much darker and more sinister. What could she really be up to? The man leaned toward me, his face almost level with mine, and whispered in an icy voice that this was a business and I had just become part of it. Now, I had only two choices: cooperate or suffer the consequences. I tried to think of a way out of there, but my mind was clouded with fear and confusion. The girl, seeing my desperation, took a step forward. Her face, now devoid of any emotion, seemed unaware of what was happening. She was there, like a pawn in a much bigger game. And then, I understood clearly what was happening. The man did not see me as a person, but as a resource, something that could be used. And the girl, she was just another tool in a perverse system that fed on the desperation and trust of others. The rain was still falling. The wind was whispering as if the storm itself was trying to warn me of what was coming. But it was too late. I was trapped. And all I could do was wait. Because in the end, you never really know what you might get into when you decide to go for a walk in the rain. Now, after everything that's happened, I always go out prepared. I've learned to be more cautious, even a little paranoid. Every time I leave the house, I carry a charge phone, an item of electricity, something I can use to defend myself if necessary. I always tell someone where I'm going, and if I change my plans, I let them know right away. Not that I think this will protect me from everything, but at least I feel I have some control over my life. Experience has taught me that you never know what might come up down the road. Sometimes people seem harmless, but that can change quickly. You can find yourself in a dangerous situation without warning, just because you made the wrong decision at the wrong time. The city, the storm, the girl. It all seems so distant now, but the fear is still there. The most important lesson I took away from that night was that you can't rely solely on the goodwill of others. In a world where the unexpected is always lurking, the best we can do is to be ready for the worst. because when things get complicated in the end, we can only count on ourselves. I never thought that an ordinary night after work could change my life. Everything seemed normal that Wednesday. The rain had been falling unceasingly since the afternoon, like a curtain of water that didn't let you see more than a few meters. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and rest. The day had been long and tiring. I was on the last leg of a major project at the office, and my mind was racing with the details, deadlines, and decisions I had to make. I left the building at 12:45 p.m. The clock on my phone indicated that, as usual, I had been working late. The area where my office was located was quiet, even in the evening hours, and I rarely passed anyone on the street. There was only one thing on my mind: getting home. I had parked my car several blocks away, so the drive there was a long walk, but without any setbacks. I thought so. The wind was blowing hard, dragging the water from the puddles and making my jacket stick to my body, but nothing out of the ordinary. There was little light, just the street lamps and the lights of nearby buildings. As I walked, my thoughts were tangled between the tension of the day and the monotony of the night. But then, a noise behind me made me stop in my tracks. It was a step, a solid, steady step, as if someone was walking right behind me with the same rhythm. I turned suddenly but saw nothing. There was only darkness in the empty street and the glow of puddles reflecting the lights of the buildings. I continued walking, but my instinct told me something wasn't right. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But the footsteps behind me kept the same pace. My breathing became faster. I tried not to pay attention to it, but the feeling that someone was watching me grew stronger. I turned again, this time more quickly, and just then I saw a man. He was tall, wearing a black coat and a cap that covered part of his face. He was about 10 meters away, but his gaze was so fixed, so penetrating, that a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to smile, to relax, but my body was already tense, as if I knew something was about to happen. The man didn't move, just watched me. His expression was hard to read, but his eyes were cold, empty, as if there was nothing beyond them. I asked him, "Is something wrong?" Even though I knew it would be best to keep walking without looking back. He didn't say anything, but I felt him getting a little closer. I quickened my pace, almost began to jog, and with each stride I heard the echo of his footsteps behind me. I couldn't tell if he was intentionally following me or just coincidentally going in the same direction. But the lack of response and the silence, except for the sound of the rain, filled me with a growing uneasiness. I decided to change course, looking for a busier street, although at that time of night the chances of finding anyone were minimal. However, every time I turned, the man turned too. His steps followed the same pattern. I didn't see him run or hurry, but he was getting closer and closer. My mind began to imagine the worst. Was he trying to rob me, or something worse? The question hovered in my head like a hammer constantly pounding. I looked around, searching for somewhere I could take shelter, but the streets were empty. I had nowhere to run. The only sound was the sound of the rain lashing the pavement, and the rhythm of my footsteps getting faster and faster. On a desperate impulse, I decided to run. Without thinking of the consequences, I dashed forward, and the echo of my own footsteps mingled with those of the man following behind me. He was too close. Was I chasing him? Or was he just enjoying the fear he could see in my eyes? I ran until I reached a corner where the nearest building had a locked entrance with a metal gate. Without thinking, I slipped down the adjacent street, hoping to lose him in the shadows. But the man kept following me. I felt he was only a few feet away. My breathing was heavy, almost painful, and fear clouded my thoughts. I was no longer thinking clearly. I turned another corner, and this time, as I turned, something changed in my head. I thought of what I had always been told: never go into dead ends, always look for a place where there are people. But it was too late. The street was empty, and there was no one who could hear me if I shouted. The man stopped a few feet away from me. I could see his face more clearly now, though his gaze remained just as cold. The distance between us was minimal. His breathing had also quickened, but the strange thing was that he didn't seem to be looking for a fight, just watching me. I asked him, "What do you want?" my voice trembling. It was the only thing I could get out of my throat. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward me. One, then another. It was a slow, measured step, but without losing control. My mind panicked. If I didn't do something now, there was no way to escape. Suddenly, an idea crossed my mind. It was risky, but I had no choice. As he took a step closer to me, I quickly ducked and with all my might ran to his left, dodging his path. The sound of his footsteps faded for a moment. Then as I turned again, I saw something that gave me a little hope. The lantern of a store open up ahead, a small convenience store with lights on. I ran there as fast as I could. At that moment, I forgot everything. All I could think about was running away. As I did so, I looked back and saw the man stop in the middle of the street, watching me leisurely, as if he already knew I couldn't catch him. I went inside the store and the owner, an older man with thick glasses, looked at me in surprise. I said nothing, just tried to calm my breathing. My hands were shaking. I quickly pointed to the street with my head and he, without a word, closed the door behind me. The sound of footsteps ceased immediately. I stood there motionless, waiting for everything to pass. The store was illuminated, and for the first time in the night I could breathe easy. However, as I looked out the window into the empty street, a strange feeling came over me. I was not completely safe. Something told me that the man had never left, that he was somehow watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to try again. I remember that night I couldn't sleep. I spent hours thinking about everything that had happened, how I had managed to escape by sheer luck. But the scariest thing wasn't how close it had come to catching me. The worst was what I felt when I saw his stare. That feeling as if he was sizing me up, as if it had all been part of a game for him. From that night on, I never went out again without carrying my charged phone, without looking over my shoulder, without making sure someone knew my whereabouts. I became more cautious, not because I wanted to live in fear, but because I understood that sometimes danger doesn't find you by accident. Sometimes it seeks you out, and when it does, there is not always a second warning. Everything changed for me from that day on. The rain pounded hard on the windows of the train. The sound was constant, like a torrent that did not stop falling, which gave me a feeling of claustrophobia. Through the window, I could only see a sea of drops that crashed against the glass and did not let me see anything beyond the diffuse shadows of the darkness. The train was moving at great speed, but the roar of the storm outside seemed louder than the rattling of the cars themselves. The carriage was relatively empty, only a few people sitting in the seats. All of them plunged into silence, as if the storm had isolated us all in an atmosphere of terrifying tension. I was traveling alone. I was on my way to a distant city, one of those business trips I used to take frequently, but which, on this occasion, had become an unsettling experience from the very beginning. I really didn't want to travel. A few seats ahead, a woman caught my eye. She was sitting by the window looking out, completely motionless. Her face was illuminated by the dim light of the carriage, and for some reason, I felt there was something strange about her presence. It wasn't that she was particularly attractive, far from it, but there was something unsettling about the way she looked, as if she was waiting for something that never came. The storm, perhaps. The train came around a sharp curve and the sound of wheels on rails changed pitch. A creak, followed by a flicker in the carriage lights. The train continued on, but I couldn't help but notice that the woman was more tense. Her hands clenched the edge of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. The train plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning outside the windows. A few seconds later, the train came to an abrupt halt. At first, I thought it had been a temporary glitch, but the train moved no further, and the silence that followed was absolute. There was none of the usual noise of engines or brakes, only the roar of the storm outside. Murmurs began to grow among the passengers. Some were already getting up, others were beginning to speak softly, but the tension was evident. I got up from my seat and headed down the aisle, trying to find some explanation. I was surprised to see that the lights in the carriage were still off. Somehow, I felt a growing discomfort, as if everything that was happening was part of something much bigger and darker than I imagined. I approached the carriage door. Nothing. It was locked. The feeling of discomfort became something else. I began to notice small details I hadn't noticed before. The woman by the window was no longer in her seat. The storm was still raging outside, but there no longer seemed to be any sounds from the other passengers. No shouting, no murmuring, no sounds of footsteps. I walked to the end of the car, where I found one of the train attendants, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. He was crouched by the connecting door, his face pale and his hands trembling. His fixed gaze on me conveyed a mixture of bewilderment and fear. The atmosphere in the train was suffocating, as if the air grew thicker with every second of uncertainty. Claustrophobia began to invade me. The train was still stopped without explanation, and the lack of response from the cabin made the situation seem even more desperate. Isn't it curious how darkness can envelop a carriage almost completely, interrupted only by unpredictable flashes of lightning? Each time the light flashed, I found myself wondering if everything was in order. The passengers, in palpable silence, seemed to be deep in their own thoughts, but their tense faces and uneasy looks made me question what was going on in their minds. And suddenly, what was that sound? Soft footsteps echoed in the distance, with such a strange cadence, almost as if someone was shuffling their feet. Who could it be? And what story was hidden in that gloom? I returned to my seat, feeling slightly dizzy and an anxiety that seemed to grow with every moment. What if we were really stuck on this motionless train, surrounded by strangers in the middle of such a fierce storm? The thought was nerve-wracking. The wind was buffeting the metal walls of the train, and I could feel the structure vibrating under the constant assault of the storm. And suddenly a scream broke the silence. A man in his 50s, who until that moment had remained calm, jumped up and ran towards the exit door. What had he seen? His expression was one of sheer terror, his eyes wild-eyed and his face unhinged as he pounded on the door with palpable desperation. What had provoked such an extreme reaction in him? That outburst of panic began to affect other passengers. Some stood up, moving between fear and confusion, looking around as if trying to find something in the darkness to explain what was happening. I got up again, pushed by unease, and approached the back of the carriage, where the woman standing by the window had begun to speak in a low voice with the young train attendant. Although I couldn't hear her words, their postures seemed strange, tense, as if they were both waiting for something or someone. The situation gave me a bad feeling. The woman and the attendant seemed oblivious to my presence, focused on a conversation that seemed laden with secrets and awkwardness. The scene filled me with an unsettling foreboding, a silent warning that something was out of place. They both fell silent. It was as if they hadn't heard me, but the woman at last looked at me. Her face was expressionless, and for a moment it seemed to me that there was something in her gaze that I did not understand, something that did not belong in this world. Before I could say anything else, a loud bang shook the train. The fear was instantaneous. A piercing scream echoed through the carriage. The man from before, the one who had started banging on the door, was gone. He had disappeared. All that remained was a bloodstain on the floor and a trail disappearing into the darkness of the corridors. People began to scream, pushing each other, looking for some way out to understand what was happening. But everything was getting more and more confusing. The young train employee ran to the cabin looking for help, but before he could get there, the carriage door slammed violently shut behind him, trapping him outside. Panic ensued. No one knew what to do, and the desperation was noticeable. I stepped back a little, trying to calm down, but the atmosphere was charged with something I couldn't identify. The woman at the window was gone, and the carriage emptied quickly, everyone scattering in all directions, looking for answers, but only finding more questions. And then a second, much louder bang shook the train. At that moment, I understood something I didn't want to know. We were not stopped in the middle of a tunnel without explanation. We were being watched, yes, and the train was not empty, far from it. Something or someone, a man or perhaps several, was stalking us. And if we didn't find a way out, there would be nothing left but corpses one by one as the storm swallowed us up. Sometimes life presents us with situations that make us question what we thought we were clear about. I have taken the train many times before, secure in the routine and its apparent safety. But today, remembering that night, I understand that reality is more fragile than we think. Danger does not always manifest itself in an obvious way. It often hides behind everyday situations, disguised as something commonplace like a trip, a storm, or an unimportant chat. After that night, something in me changed. I began to be more cautious and pay attention to details I used to overlook. Life sometimes doesn't offer second chances. Danger doesn't always come with warning signs. It often disguises itself in everyday situations, such as a trip, a storm, or even small talk. That's why, after that night, something changed in me. I began to be more cautious, to pay attention to details I used to overlook. Life sometimes doesn't offer second chances, and I'm taking advantage of this one.